Good evening. Hello. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you today about my recent book, Brought to Life by the Voice, Playback Singing and Cultural Politics in South India. Playback refers to a process of separately recording and subsequently synchronizing oral and visual tracks in the production of the song sequences that are a central part of Indian popular films. Playback singers are so called because their voices are first recorded in the studio and then played back on the set as the visuals of the song sequence are being filmed. In my book, I move beyond a narrow techno-industrial explanation of playback to explore its significance as a realm of vocality and performance that has become intricately encoded with meaning over the roughly 70 years it has been in use in South India. Unlike in the North American context, where across a range of cinematic and other performance contexts, there's a strong emphasis on the presentation of a seemingly unified body and voice, in the Indian context, voice-body unity has not been the assumed ideal. Instead, since the 1950s, the dissociation between body and voice, supported by the division of labor between acting and appearing and singing, has been the norm. Rather than being a shameful or hidden secret, playback singers are well known, often achieving greater renown and celebrity and enjoying longer careers than the on-screen actors for whom they provide the singing voice. But even beyond the films themselves, playback singers' voices are a prominent element of oral public culture throughout India. There's no separate popular music industry in India, so film songs have constituted the main source of popular music. They enjoy wide circulation apart from the films and are often consumed as songs rather than as sequences or song sequences from films. At the same time, the song's embeddedness in film narratives and their visual aspects, as well as the association of singers' voices with particular actors and actresses, add layers of meaning to the playback voices. In trying to understand playback as a realm of vocality and a space of performance, I've drawn on the study of voice across different contexts and genres. This slide gives you some of the representative works that inform my study of playback singing. The film voice, with the idea of the acousmetra, the power of the unseen voice, and the exploration of the soundtrack as independent from the visual track. Opera, with its attention to artifice and the suspension of disbelief, the mismatch of body and voice, and the gendered typology of voices. Musicals, with their tension between the number and the narrative, and the exploration of the many things that can happen within the space of a song. And pop music, with its fragmented and formulaic modes of production, the pop star as a commodified celebrity, and the combination of liveness and mediation in performance. Two goals motivate my project. First, I'm interested in understanding more deeply the way that the sensuous and sonic qualities of voices are endowed with social meaning in any given context. And second, I seek to destabilize and critique essentializing notions of voice as a simple sign of agency, identity, or artistic expression, often assumed as part of a unified package in Euro-Western thinking about the voice. Playback singing is a deliberate way of dividing labor and parceling out roles. The singer and the on-screen actor, the lyricist, the music composer, are all different persons in the context of Indian cinema. Playback thus provides a way to think in original terms about how the material and sonic aspects of embodied and mediated vocal acts are linked to claims to personhood, agency, and representation, and about how acts of voicing, both musical and linguistic or non-musical, are implicated in structures of power. I use the concept of regimes of orality and voice as an organizing theoretical premise. Voice, as much recent scholarship in voice studies has demonstrated, is a site where macro-level constructs are scaled down to bodily level, constituting a naturalized domain of aesthetics and sensibilities that are produced and reproduced through embodied practice, performance, and mediated consumption. Regimes of orality and voice as an idea is meant to include both the embodied and sonic, as well as the ideological aspects of voice, to capture the way voice is often simultaneously an object of musical and sonic attention and a site of ideological investment. I think about regimes of orality and voice in several ways: through modes of discipline in vocal production, how singers learn to produce the right kind of sound in any context; through recurring contexts of listening and consumption, including performance contexts as well as technological media through which voices are disseminated; and through the articulated verbalized categories that arise to describe and attribute meaning to particular voices and voice qualities. Inherent in the idea of regimes of orality and voice is the process of regimentation, the shaping of vocal practices and vocal sound to particular cultural and historically specific ideals. In my book, I focus on how playback in the South Indian context where I've worked has produced a gendered regimentation of voices, and how those gendered ideals have shifted in the 70-plus years that playback has been in use, and what is at stake in those shifts. My historical and ethnographic work has taken place in the Tamil film industry, based in Chennai, formerly Madras, which, along with Bombay and Calcutta, was historically one of the three major hubs of Indian film production. The Tamil film industry is one of India's most prolific, producing between 150 and 200 films per year, only slightly fewer than the number of Hindi-language films produced each year in Bollywood. My book situates playback within the cultural and political context of Tamil South India, from the post-independence period to the post-liberalization present, tracking the emergence of playback in the 1940s and 50s, its consolidation in the 1960s through 80s, and its partial dismantling since the 1990s. This relatively long time frame reveals how playback as an institution has both shaped and been shaped by a wider socio-political context. Since the 1990s, changes in India's media environment, spurred by India's economic liberalization, new technological capacities for sound manipulation, and structural changes in the film and entertainment industries, have transformed earlier modes of production and ideals associated with playback. Playback started as a form of experimentation, specifically with the female voice and body in the early 1940s. It was a critical component of the larger project of managing the way the female form would come to be heard and seen in the public sphere through various media forms and performance genres in the mid-20th century. This meant that the female voice was subject to more scrutiny and conscious manipulation than the male voice. When playback began to be used in the 1940s in the Tamil language film industry, it was a distinctly gendered practice, focused on substituting new voices for those of actresses, even while the voice-body unity of the male singing actor was left intact. Once playback became standard practice in the 1950s, a regimentation of gendered vocal sound followed. Although the playback system theoretically made possible many different kinds of voice-body pairings, it in fact led to a greater regimentation of gendered vocal sound, eliminating earlier forms of gender ambiguity, androgyny, and play with voices. The regimentation occurred in two linked ways. At the sonic level, one can hear a distinct differentiation of pitch register from the mid-1950s on, with female voices moving generally upward in pitch and male voices moving downward. This shift was also influenced by the mutual sonic and ideological differentiation between film music and South Indian classical Carnatic music at this time. The contrast became particularly pronounced for female singers, especially in regard to vocal pitch and timbre. While the idealized female film voice ascended to the upper registers, classical music resolutely avoided the use of the female head voice and maintained a thicker and more weighty timbre, described as ganam. The new female playback voice that would come to dominate in the 1950s and 60s with its high pitch was also cultivated to be maximally different from male film voices. This was in contrast to earlier decades, when most singing actresses sang at a noticeably lower pitch, and there was no appreciable difference in male and female vocal range. So, for instance, in this slide, you can see M.K. Tyagaraja Bhagavatar, popular singing actor of the 1930s and 40s, who had a singing voice that overlapped in range with that of his female co-star, T.R. Rajakumari. Listening to their voices in this clip, you can hear that they're in the same range. And if you advance the clip to about 58 seconds, you will be able to hear that. Listening to their voices in this clip, you can hear that they're in the same range. Comparing female voices of the 1940s with those of the professional playback singers of the 1950s and 60s, you can hear a distinct rise in fundamental pitch. In these examples, you can also hear how the male voice has lowered.
கலையே ஓவியமே கண்ணில் வந்து மின்னல் போல் காணுதே இன்ப காவிய கலையே ஓவியமே செழும் கனி போல சுவை தரும் மாமணி.
Sorry. And then in this second example, you can also hear the separation of the range of male and female voices. Comparing the female voices of the 1940s with those of the professional playback singers of the 50s and 60s, then you can hear this distinct rise in fundamental pitch. And you can also hear how the male voice has lowered. Occurring alongside and linked to this sonic regimentation was another process I've called indexical regimentation. Indexicality, a term from linguistic anthropology, draws attention to the ways that language and other expressive forms carry social meaning by pointing to associations with different socially recognized characters or types. Building on the regimentation of the qualities of the voice itself, pitch, volume, timbre, etc., indexical regimentation is a process of controlling and narrowing the associations that are permitted to be made with those qualities. Indexical regimentation is a reduction of possibilities for the kinds of associations or meanings that can go with a particular voice. Female voices came to be typologized, complexly differentiated along a kind of virgin-vamp dichotomy. It was not only the female voice that was subject to sonic and indexical regimentation. In the 1950s, the male voice also came to be appropriately masculinized, leaving behind the varied and ornate vocal aesthetics of a generation of singing actors. I trace the path of this regimentation of vocal masculinity in the rise of a single male singer, T.M. Soundararajan, who achieved a near monopoly over male roles by the 1960s and 70s by cultivating a middle-range voice and non-virtuosic style that was thought to suit all the major hero stars of the day. The repeated use and resulting ubiquity of this single male voice was central to constructing a distinctive form of male stardom that fused cinematic and political power. Importantly, the kind of indexical regimentation that male singers' voices were subject to was different from that of female singers. Unlike female singers who were classified along a virgin-vamp dichotomy, male singers were classified by ethno-linguistic identity, their Tamilness or their non-Tamilness. The single male voice that came to dominate in the 1950s and held sway until the 1980s, described as having a ringing or shining quality, was cultivated as an everyman kind of voice that came to represent Tamil ethno-linguistic identity in a way that no female voice could lay claim to. The regimentation process worked not only by controlling the meanings that could go with a particular voice, but also by controlling the voice that could go with particular actors, scenes, or characters. In the 1950s and 60s, a very few singers sang the majority of roles in Tamil films, so that their voices became ubiquitous and instantly recognizable. In these slides, you can see T.M. Soundararajan, the single male singer who monopolized male singing roles, and P. Sushila, who was almost always singing for chaste, wifely, or demure kinds of female characters. They were said to work behind the scenes like husband and wife. In the 1960s, as certain voices began to dominate, a typology of female voices which would hold for several decades was solidified. The division between female voices considered to be sweet and licit and those deemed to be immoral and loose was held up by another kind of regimentation, that of the female singer's role. She was, quote, just the voice, as singers of this generation described it to me, a role confined to singing words and melodies that others had composed. Her role excluded acting, speaking, and in live stage performances, it meant that she had to maintain absolute bodily stillness. Various technological, discursive, and performative labors were undertaken to construct and maintain the respectability of female playback singers. Singing was framed in a very specific way, not to be confused with acting or other modes of vocal expression, such as speaking or expressing emotions, which might imply the involvement of the singer's body, will, or intention. Being just the voice meant being a machine-like technology for reproducing songs that others had composed and written, and that still others would embody on the screen. The singer's own emotional involvement and artistic intentionality were not only not at stake, but were specifically disavowed by this idea. The female singers who achieved this ideal were praised as having kural inimai, voice sweetness, a term that did not only refer to vocal timbre and style, but also to normatively gendered bodily and personal comportment. Within this ideal, a tension developed between the ideal of staying within the singing frame, being just the voice, and the forms of excess that could intrude if a singer seemed to allow her body or intention into the performance. A whole repertoire of vocal sounds and techniques came to stand as signs of illicit female desire, feminine uncontainment, and immodesty, ranging from loud and quick singing, vibrato, a type of pronunciation identified with folk singing, melismatic vocal drops or rises at the ends of lines, and ranging to the stylized laughs, cries, sighs, and other sounds that were known as effects. These were moments of performative excess that spilled out of the narrative or representational frame and exploited the fine and permeable line between singing and acting. The labeling of these as effects was meant to separate them from singing as such and to distance them from the will or intention of the singer. Only certain female singers would do so-called effects, and most limited them to crying or soft sighs, which were seen as more respectable than gasps, laughs, and other sounds. Okay, so in that second part, the playback singer was performing these hiccup effects, also something that only this singer would do. So in this clip, you can get a sense of what effects sounded like and how they were used. And the fact that a space was created within the vocal typology of female singers for a singer who transgressed all of the norms of gendered respectability continues to be interesting to me.
La la எனக்கும் வர வேண்டும்.
Okay, so the pop, you can hear that husky, like what they call husky, this sort of breathiness in the voice, both for the female and the male voices. The popularity of the husky voice is linked to a trend in Tamil cinema since the millennium, the rise of so-called realist films that provided an alternative to the over-the-top heroism of the masala film. Rather than glorify a male hero star, these new films presented so-called ordinary heroes. A husky vocal timbre was adopted to voice this new youthful male subject, not necessarily because huskiness possesses an inherent meaning, but because it was meaningfully contrasted with gendered vocal norms of earlier decades.
Open Nidane, Nidane, open Nidane, Nidane. காத்தோடு காத்தானே கண்ணே ஓமுச்சானே நீரோட நீரானே உன் கூட மீனானே காகிதம் போலே ஓமேலே ஓவியம் வரையும் நகமானே மோகத்தில் பெண்ணே ஒன்னானே முத்தங்கள் வாழும் முகமானே இலை மறைவில் மலர்ந்திருந்தோம் மழை துளியா கலந்திருந்தோ
காத்தோடு காத்தானே கண்ணே ஓமுச்சானே நீரோடு நீரானே உன் கூட மீனானே
இலையில் மலரின் கைரேகை இமைகள் யாவும் மயில் தோகை
1000 ஆண்டுகளானாலும் ஆனந்த வன்மம் மறவேனே
மழை போலவே மடியில் தவழ்ந்த மயக்கம் தீரவே இல்லை
2 பேருமே இனிமேல் யாரோ இறைவன் கைகளில் பிள்ளை
கண்மணி பூ பூக்க காதல் விதையானோ
காமன் நாட்குறிப்பில் காதல் கதையானோ காத்தோடு காத்தானே கண்ணே ஓமுச்சானே நீரோடு நீரானே உன் கூட மீனானே
பூவின் மீது கூத்தாடும் போதை வண்டு போலானே
புல்லின் மீது பூமியைப் போல் உந்தன் பாரம் நான் கண்டேன்.
இதழின் ஆற்றிலை குதிக்கும் போது கரைகள் என்பதே இல்லை.
கரைகள் இல்லை, பரவாயில்லை, கடலி காதலின் எல்லை.
வேர்வை துளிகளிலே என்னை நனைத்தாயே, இதயம் நொறுங்கத்தான் இறுக்கி அணைத்தாயே. காத்தோடு காத்தான கண்ணே மூச்சான, நீரோடு நீரான உன் கூட மீனான, ஆயிரம் ஆசைகள் தாலாட்ட உன் மார்பினில் மெல்ல விழுந்தேனே. விழிகள் மூடிய நடந்ததெல்லாம் கண்டேன், ரசித்தேன், சுகமானே. இலை மறைவில் மலர்ந்திருந்தோ, மழை துளியாய் கலந்திருந்தோ.
So the chart on this slide shows how the sonic aspects of the husky voice, its pitch, its sound quality, its breathiness, constitute an ambiguous space between earlier gendered vocal norms, allowing this voice to stand for a new kind of post-liberalization youth subject with claims to vocal cosmopolitanism. In addition to the hero's ordinariness, the definitive sign of realism in these films is in their presentation of female desire outside the normative bounds of family and marriage, something that would have previously been unrepresentable on screen. So-called husky voices, in not adhering to previous norms of male or female vocal production, serve as signs of this realm outside the normative. Their different, so-called different sounding voices, seemingly not bound by training or cultural convention, in which emotion and feeling were conveyed through stylized, set-apart effects. Husky voices are rather engaged in a seemingly natural expression of feeling in the act of singing itself. But while the husky voice has come to be associated with ordinary youthful masculinity and with emotionally vulnerable heroes who fall in love, for female characters and female singers, it's associated with an elevated class standing and a westernized, that is, an upper class, non-ordinary upbringing. In other words, a husky sound represents male ordinariness, an unmarked male subject, but represents female abnormality or foreignness, a marked female subject. This asymmetry derives from the way the husky voice blurs normatively gendered qualities. Thinking again about the range of qualities subsumed under husky voice, chestiness, low pitch, breathiness, we find that the first two are normatively gendered male, while the last, breathiness, is normatively gendered female. It's also the one that is most consciously adopted and manipulated by singers of either gender. In borrowing the feminized attribute, the male singer and character shows his vulnerability and ordinariness, but in borrowing the masculine attributes, the female singers or characters are distanced from the norm. The male qualities of chestiness and low pitch, because they are naturalized attributes of male-sounding voices, are assumed to be not so much consciously adopted stylistic elements as inherent characteristics of a male voice. When these qualities manifest in a female voice, the singer is said not simply to be singing husky, but to have a husky voice. I never heard this latter statement made about any male singer. While huskiness is simply something a male singer can assume or shed at will, as this phrase suggests, it sticks to a female singer's voice. It's part of her persona and her character. Entering the realm of the ambiguously gendered husky voice thus has different implications for male and female singers. And so I hope that this chart gives you a sense of the way that the husky voice in this middle column here is kind of located in a space between earlier female gendered norms and earlier male gendered norms. That's what this chart is trying to express here. So, in conclusion, both the sweet voice of the 1960s through 80s and the husky voice of the post-millennium, with their gendered meanings, had to be produced. I've stressed the importance of the wider social and semiotic system in this process. The regimentation that produced the sweet voice of the 1960s female playback singers was achieved through a process of differentiating it in multiple ways. That is, from the male voice, from the classical voice, and from the voice of the vamp as voiced by L.R. Iswari. Similarly, the husky voice derives its specifically gendered meaning from its location within a typology of voices, particularly its opposition to gendered vocal ideals of the previous decades. Although we would certainly recognize the husky voice used in this South Indian context as part of a globally circulating aesthetic, the specific and the asymmetrically gendered meanings of the husky voice are more complex than a simple story of supposedly borrowing from the West. I hope that these examples from my work are useful for thinking about voice, gender, and social meaning in other contexts. I'll end with some general questions. What is the relationship between sonic and indexical regimentation? Does the disciplining or regimentation of vocal sound itself always entail the regimentation of its meaning as well? This is a more specific way of framing the question of how the sonic and sensuous aspects of voice, or any sound for that matter, are given meaning. Since the meaning of vocal sound is not inherent in the sound itself, what are the historical processes and the social and semiotic systems through which meaning comes to be naturalized and comes to be felt as part of the sound itself? Those are some of the questions that I have tried to deal with in this book, and I hope that this has been useful, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.